Business Unity South Africa and the Confederation of Indian Industry have been discussing shared experiences on how South African companies can successfully navigate their way into the Indian business environment. Joining us now on the prospects of doing business in India is Robert Applebaum, who's a partner at Webber Wentzel Attorneys. Robert, thanks so much for your time. We do know that Indian investment in Africa has topped or is nearing the $50 billion mark, but there's often this view that the relationship is skewed in favor of India. Is that a wrong perception?
It's probably, no, the perception is probably right, but that's not the Indian fault. That's the opportunities in India that Africans and South Africans haven't as yet been taking advantage of.
And we're not taking advantage of them as Africans because we're not industrious, or because the environment in India is very constrained?
I think perception. I think there's a perception that it's difficult to do business in India. It's not as difficult as one thinks. Mm-hmm. There's some barriers to entry, but the barriers to entry everywhere. Yeah. And maybe the size is just daunting.
How restrictive is the environment? I mean, we're told that, this 9% growth we're seeing in India is largely as a result of the deregulation of the economy. But those on the ground say the economy isn't as deregulated as we think. There's still a lot of government bias in favor of local businesses.
Oh, there's no doubt. I mean, there's a lot of regulation to start, and there's some protectionism. So I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
In for example, the retail industry. So a foreigner could own a mass market could go in, and a foreigner could own a wholesaler or something of that nature. Yeah. If one wished to own a ShopRite, Checkers, or Pick n Pay or Woolworths, something in India, that's prohibited for a foreigner. In relation to a single retail brand, so assuming you went in and you had a brand such as an Adidas, whatever, the foreigner could own 51%. So that's the one. I mean, in some of the areas it's very regulated, right. In others it's not.
I think for many investors who go into a new market, particularly in greenfields projects, they'd want to do it on a joint venture basis. But we're told this is where the government is particularly intrusive. They don't support the idea of those joint ventures.
No, on the contrary, I think the opposite, in fact, is correct. When we advise any client and going into India, we normally suggest find someone who understands the environment, someone that's trusted, and go along with them. Very rarely would you find someone trying. There have been a few South African experiences that have been bad, but those have been stubborn people not wanting to choose partners or choose the correct partners.
What about incentives for investments by way of tax waivers, reduced import duties, those sorts of things? How beneficial is it for anybody bringing or starting a new kind of business in India?
They are easier. The incentives in India are easier to access than ours. They're not huge. So, for example, for SEZs, there would be incentives. In the power area right now, there are incentives. If you're going to go out into some rural area, there'd be incentives. So, but I mean, the fact is that it's a huge economy and a huge population. Therein lies a huge incentive.
Right. And talking about sort of those administrative barriers, just looking at reports today, there have been symposia being held in New Zealand, for instance, where it's very difficult for New Zealanders working for Indian companies to go on sabbatical, to go on a transfer, just getting business visas, local licenses. It's very difficult for those kinds of investors. What about for us?
It isn't. I mean, in terms of their version of home affairs, it's not particularly difficult. To get a long-term work permit is difficult from the perspective that you've got to prove, as do most countries, that you couldn't give the job to an Indian. But in India, in assuming you're earning $25,000 per annum or more, then you're in the game. You've got to be bringing a real skill. For temporary transfers, not particularly difficult and relatively facilitative. But the regulation to a large extent tries to keep out the minnows. So if you look at, they encourage mining and construction companies coming in. But in terms of, say, construction, one can set up without any regulation, but then there's certain requirements, so the size of the transaction, when you could start removing money from the country, etc., etc., etc. So it's done to encourage the bigger players in, not the smaller players. That may be the New Zealand problem.
The size of the transaction, how active is the central bank in India, the Bank of India, in terms of also having a hand in what sort of foreign direct investment that they want? We know that in South Africa often deals fall through because the Reserve Bank didn't approve the local content and how much money was going to leave the country. So those sorts of foreign exchange regulations can be prohibitive in this environment. What about in India?
Not really. I mean, the central bank is very strong and very direct and does have a hand in. So in relation to inflows and outflows, they're very cautious. But I've yet to see any transaction where they've actually interfered for a political reason. So if they interfere, they're generally they're highly regulated, but very well regulated.
Yeah. And then just in terms of African and South African investors, and I hate to draw that distinction, but anyway, there we are, who are wanting to go into India, which sort of sectors, you've spoken about prospective mining, but which sort of areas would the Indian government really welcome the expertise of Africans?
Number one, mining. Okay. Number two, construction. I mean, the infrastructure boom there is terrifying. Our financial service sector, I mean, First Rand Bank has done very well there. Sanlam's in, Old Mutual's in, Hollard's in. They're there for a reason. It's an area that was untapped in India, and our skill sets are really superb. Other than that, in relation to some very niche areas in healthcare, but other than that, I'd say those would be the main ones going into India.
And the rule of law and the general legal framework in which people operate, one of the biggest concerns when people come to Africa is the fundamental issue around property rights and whether or not your business is yours, whether the government could ever nationalize it. When contracts are not honored, what recourse do you have? What's it like there?
The body of laws in India are really good. A bit archaic, but pretty good. Giving effect or protecting one's rights is slightly more interesting because the Indian legal system is incredibly slow. So a couple of years ago, and in fact last year, there was an article in the Times of India which said that the average High Court matter took 12 to 15 years to fruition. But there's a way around that. When we take clients into India, we propose to them that we have an arbitration clause and it's outside of India. And Singapore being one of the favorite places. So I mean, other than that, I mean, yeah, the Indian legal system is a slow system. It's a good system, but it is a slow system.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much for your time, Robert Applebaum, who's a partner at Webber Wentzel, just talking us through India. And I think you're quite bullish about India, and you're just basically saying, go, don't be afraid.
I sure am.
Absolutely.